My name is Clara, and I'm 32 years old. For most of my life, the world has been a beautiful, blurry thing, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. My family pitied me for the way I had to press my nose to the world to see it, the way I held books an inch from my face and squinted at photographs as if trying to decipher a secret code. They never imagined that this supposed curse, this terrible eyesight they so often lamented on my behalf, would be the one thing to save us from ruin. All thanks to a secret my grandfather left behind in the shaky line of a single letter. It was a secret hidden in plain sight, a microscopic betrayal that only I was ever equipped to see. Before I dive into the story of how my greatest weakness became our only strength, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Drop a comment down below and say hello. And if you've ever had a moment where something you were self-conscious about turned out to be a surprising gift, go ahead and hit that like button. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe because this is a community for stories just like this one. The world from a distance was always an impressionist masterpiece to me. Soft edges and blended colors. But up close it was a universe of infinite detail. This was the trade-off of my severe myopia. I couldn't recognize a friend from across the street, but I could see the tiny, feathered legs of a dust mite on a sunbeam. I couldn't read a billboard, but I could tell you the precise way a single drop of ink had bled into the fibers of an old page. My family, especially my Uncle Robert, never saw the second part of that equation. They only saw the first. To them, my vision wasn't a different way of seeing. It was a defect. Pity was the language they used to speak to me about it. "Oh, Clara, let me get that for you," my mother Helen would say, reaching for a menu before I could. "Poor dear, you must get such headaches," my aunt would sigh. But Uncle Robert was the worst. He wielded his pity like a weapon, a constant reminder of my perceived inadequacy. He was my mother's older brother, a man who moved through the world with the unearned confidence of someone who had never been truly challenged. He had perfect vision, a perfect smile, and a perfectly hollow heart. At family gatherings, he'd make a show of reading the fine print on a gift or a bottle of wine. "Let's see what we have here," he'd boom, holding it at a comfortable arm's length. "Clara, you'd need a microscope for this, wouldn't you?" He'd say with a chuckle that wasn't meant to be kind. I learned to smile politely, a tight, brittle thing that didn't reach my eyes, and retreat into my own world, the one that existed within arm's reach. My sanctuary was my small workshop, a room at the back of my apartment that smelled of old paper, leather, and binding glue. I was a book restorer, a profession I'd stumbled into that felt more like a calling. It was a job that didn't just accommodate my strange vision. It celebrated it. Here, my need to be close to my subject was an asset. I'd spend hours with a single page, my face inches away, mending tears with tissue so fine it was nearly invisible, identifying the faintest trace of foxing on a centuries-old manuscript. My tools were delicate instruments of precision, bone folders, finishing presses, and an array of magnifying lamps that could make a single grain of sand look like a boulder. The person who had understood this, the only one who had never pitied me, was my grandfather, Julian. He was a watchmaker, a master of a world even smaller than my own. His workshop was a magical place, a room filled with the quiet, rhythmic ticking of 100 tiny hearts. It smelled of metal and oil and the faint, clean scent of cleaning solutions. When I was a little girl, he would lift me onto his stool, and my world would shrink to the workbench in front of me. He would place a loupe in my eye, and suddenly I could see the intricate dance of gears and springs, the impossibly small rubies that served as bearings, the delicate sweep of a second hand. He saw my vision not as a flaw, but as a specialization. "You don't have bad eyes, my little songbird," he told me once, his own eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "You have focused eyes. Most people see the whole forest and miss the beauty of a single leaf. You see the leaf, every vein, every imperfection, every drop of dew. It's a gift, Clara. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." He was the one who bought me my first set of restoration tools, who encouraged my love of old, forgotten things. Our bond was forged in the quiet appreciation of the miniature, the overlooked, the exquisitely detailed. He was my champion. His health had been robust for all of his 87 years, so the stroke felt like a violent, sudden betrayal. It stole his voice and the steady confidence of his hands. For 3 agonizing weeks, he was trapped inside his own body, his brilliant mind still sharp but unable to command the machinery of speech or motion. It was during this terrible limbo-like period that Uncle Robert took control. He became the gatekeeper, the manager of all affairs, the picture of a devoted son. He handled the hospital paperwork, consulted with the doctors, and updated the family with a somber, authoritative air. "Don't you worry about a thing, Helen," he'd say to my mother, patting her hand while she wept. "I've got it all under control." I found his sudden efficiency unsettling. He had always been the son who visited on holidays, the one who called when he needed something. My grandfather had often complained in his gentle way about Robert's lack of interest in the family business, the watchmaking legacy Julian had built from nothing. Robert saw it as a dusty, unprofitable relic. Yet now he was a constant presence, his brow furrowed with performative concern. One afternoon, a week before my grandfather passed, Robert emerged from his hospital room looking grave. "I just had a moment of clarity with Dad," he announced to my mother and me in the waiting room. He was able to communicate. He wanted to make some changes to simplify things for us all. I had Mr. Gable draw up some updated papers, and Dad managed to sign them. It was a struggle, but he insisted. He wanted to make sure everything was taken care of. My mother, exhausted and clinging to any sliver of hope, just nodded. "Oh, Robert, thank you for being so strong." I felt a cold prickle of unease. My grandfather could barely hold a cup. How could he have signed a legal document? But to voice such a suspicion then felt ghoulish, a betrayal of the somber unity of our grief. I said nothing, burying the doubt deep inside me. When Julian finally passed away, the grief was a physical thing, a heavy shroud that suffocated all other thoughts. My unease was forgotten, lost in the overwhelming tide of sorrow. The reading of the will took place 2 weeks later in the stuffy mahogany-paneled office of Mr. Gable, our family lawyer for over 40 years. The room was heavy with the scent of old leather and the unspoken tensions that hummed between the 3 of us. My mother sat beside me, her shoulders slumped, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. Uncle Robert sat opposite us, looking impeccably funereal in a dark suit, his expression a carefully crafted mask of solemnity. Mr. Gable, a kind but frail man whose eyesight was beginning to fail him, cleared his throat and began to read. The preamble was standard, full of legal jargon that washed over me. Then he got to the disposition of the assets. To his beloved daughter Helen, he bequeathed the sum of $50,000. My mother let out a small, quiet gasp. It was a pittance, a fraction of what anyone would have expected. To his beloved granddaughter Clara, he bequeathed his complete set of watchmaking tools and a further sum of $10,000. I felt a lump form in my throat. The tools were a treasure, a direct link to him, but the monetary distribution felt wrong, felt cold. And then came the final, brutal blow. "All the rest, residue and remainder of my estate," Mr. Gable read, his voice wavering slightly, "including all real and personal property, my business known as Julian's Timepieces, and all shares and accounts, I give and bequeath to my son Robert." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a gunshot in a library. I stared at Robert, whose face was a study in feigned astonishment. He shook his head slowly, as if bewildered. I don't understand," he murmured, his voice thick with false emotion. "I never would have expected this. Dad must have had his reasons." My mother started to cry, not loudly, but with the silent, heartbreaking sobs of someone utterly broken. She wasn't crying about the money. She was crying about the perceived rejection, the final posthumous declaration of her father's favoritism. Robert crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, wrapping an arm around her. "Sure, Helen, it's all right," he cooed, the perfect, comforting brother. "Don't you worry about a thing. I'll take care of you." We have to respect father's final wishes, no matter how surprising they may be. I watched the scene, and the cold prickle of unease I'd felt at the hospital returned, this time as a knot of ice in my stomach. This wasn't grief. This wasn't surprise. This was a performance. And as my uncle comforted my weeping mother, a single thought echoed in my mind, cold and clear as a winter morning. Asterisk, this is wrong. All of this is wrong. Asterisk, my grandfather loved his children equally. He was a man of balance and precision, in his work and in his heart. He would never have done this. He would never have shattered my mother's heart for the sake of his son's greed. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. In the weeks that followed the reading of the will, a dreary, oppressive fog settled over our lives. My mother seemed to shrink, retreating into a shell of grief and confusion. She moved through her days in a daze, her conversations circling back to the same painful question. Why? What did I do wrong? Uncle Robert, meanwhile, moved with unnerving speed. He was a whirlwind of decisive action. He had the locks changed on my grandfather's house, a place where my mother and I had spent countless happy afternoons. He put the house on the market almost immediately, claiming the upkeep was just too much for one person to handle. He spoke of liquidating the assets of the watchmaking shop, of selling my grandfather's priceless collection of antique timepieces to an auction house in the city. "We have to be practical, Helen," he'd say during his brief, patronizing phone calls. "Nostalgia doesn't pay the bills. Dad was a bit of a sentimentalist, but we have to look to the future." Each word was a shovel of dirt on my grandfather's memory. The workshop, that sanctuary of quiet precision, was to be dismantled. The legacy Julian had spent a lifetime building was being treated like a common estate sale. The injustice of it all was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. It fueled my sleepless nights and haunted my days. My own grief for my grandfather became tangled with a growing, righteous anger. I kept replaying conversations in my head, fragments of things Julian had said over the years. I remembered a conversation we'd had just 6 months before his stroke. We were in his workshop, and he was showing me a particularly complex movement he was restoring. "One day, this will all be here for the family," he had said, gesturing around the room. "I've made sure of it in my will. It's to be shared. The money, the house. It's for both my children. But the workshop." He had looked at me, his eyes full of meaning. "The workshop needs a guardian. Someone who understands its heart." The memory was so vivid, so contrary to the document Mr. Gable had read, that it felt like a ghost screaming in my ear. My mother, lost in her own sorrow, couldn't hear it. I tried to talk to her one evening as we sat in her dimly lit living room, surrounded by photographs of a happier time. "Mom," I began gently, "don't you think it's strange? Everything Uncle Robert is doing. It's not what Grandpa would have wanted." She just shook her head, her gaze fixed on a photo of her as a young girl on her father's shoulders. "Your uncle is grieving too, Clara," she whispered, her voice fragile. "He's just handling it differently. Please don't say such things. I can't bear any more conflict." Her dismissal, her inability to even consider the possibility of a betrayal, made me feel utterly alone. I realized then that if there was a truth to be found, I would have to find it myself. My quest began with a simple, calculated request. I called Uncle Robert, my voice carefully pitched to sound like the meek, sentimental niece he believed me to be. "Uncle Robert," I said, "I know this might sound silly, but I was wondering if I could get a copy of the will. Just the signature page. I'd like to frame Grandpa's signature to have something of his." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the condescending smile forming on his face. "Why, Clara, that's a sweet idea," he said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "Of course, dear. Anything for you. I'll have my assistant send over a high-quality scan right away. You can print it out and put it in a nice frame." He was so confident, so sure of my harmlessness. That confidence would be his undoing. The email arrived the next day. A crisp, high-resolution PDF of the last page of the will. I printed it on the best quality paper I had and looked at it. The signature was there, at the bottom of the page. Julian Monroe. It looked right. The familiar loupes, the distinguished slant. To a casual observer it was perfect. But I was not a casual observer. My feeling of wrongness, that deep, intuitive certainty, had not faded. It was time to stop feeling and start seeing. I took the printed page to my workshop, my sanctuary. I cleared my workbench, wiping it down until the surface was immaculate. The only light came from my powerful articulating lamp, which cast a pool of clean white light onto the desk. This was my element. I went to a box filled with my grandfather's old things, letters he'd written me at summer camp, birthday cards signed with a flourish, old business ledgers from his shop filled with his meticulous handwriting. I carefully selected a dozen examples of his signature, from 20 years ago to as recently as the previous Christmas. I laid them out in a row next to the copy from the will. My heart hammered in my chest. What if I was wrong? What if I was just a grieving granddaughter creating conspiracies out of sorrow? I took a deep breath, pushing the doubt away. I trusted my grandfather. And I trusted the cold knot of certainty in my gut. I slid my stool closer to the bench and reached for my tools. Not the tools of a book restorer this time, but the ones my grandfather had given me. I picked up his favorite loupe, a beautiful brass Bosch and Loupe with a powerful 10x magnification. I settled it into my eye socket, the way he had taught me, and the world shrank to the tiny circle of glass. I started with the genuine signatures, examining each one in turn. I studied the flow, the rhythm of the ink. In his youth, his signature was bold, the pressure firm and even. As he aged, a slight tremor had appeared, a faint wavering, particularly on the downstrokes of the J and the L. It was the natural, delicate tremor of an old but steady hand, a hand that had spent 70 years working with infinitesimal precision. I memorized the character of that tremor, the unique way his hand moved across the paper. It was as intimate and familiar to me as the sound of his voice. I spent hours in that silent, brightly lit space, moving from one signature to the next, immersing myself in the geography of my grandfather's hand. The work was slow, meticulous, exactly the kind of task my entire life had trained me for. The world outside my workshop faded away. There was only the paper, the ink, and the truth I was determined to find. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I moved the loupe over to the signature from the will. I held my breath. At first glance, under magnification, it was still remarkably good. The forger, and I was now certain it was a forger, had done their homework. They had replicated the general shape, the spacing, the distinctive loop of the J. They had even attempted to replicate the tremor of old age. A lesser I would have been fooled. A lawyer, glancing at it to verify, would have been fooled. But my eyes were not lesser eyes. They were focused eyes. I traced the path of the ink, millimeter by millimeter. I saw the way the pen had been lifted and repositioned in places where my grandfather's stroke would have been continuous. I saw a slight difference in the angle of the cross on the N. These were inconsistencies, but they weren't proof. They were whispers of a lie, not a confession. I felt a surge of frustration. Was I imagining it? Was this just wishful thinking? I pushed back from the desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The glare from the lamp was giving me a headache. I almost gave up. I almost consigned myself to the belief that my grandfather had simply changed, that in his final days, he had become a man I didn't recognize. But then I looked at the photo of him I kept on my workbench. His kind eyes smiling out at me. "You see the leaf, Clara." His voice in my memory was a gentle encouragement. I took another deep breath and leaned back in, adjusting the lamp for a different angle of light, a technique I used to spot subtle indentations in paper. I decided to focus on one single letter. The final N. In his first name, Julian. In every genuine example, the arch of the N was a single, fluid motion. Even with the age-related tremor, the stroke was confident, executed without a second thought. It was muscle memory, ingrained over 87 years. I moved the loupe back to the signature on the will, My focus narrowed to that single final letter. And then I saw it. It wasn't a grand, obvious flaw. It was a universe of damning evidence contained in a space smaller than a pinhead. At the very apex of the N, the highest point of the arch, there was a tremor. But it was the wrong kind of tremor. It wasn't the gentle, wavering line of my grandfather's aging hand. It was a microscopic, jagged hesitation. The pressure of the ink was subtly, almost imperceptibly, thicker there. It was the mark of a hand that had paused. A hand that was drawing, not writing. A hand that was concentrating so hard on replicating a shape that it had lost the natural rhythm of a signature. It was the tremor of forgery. My grandfather's tremor was born of age. This tremor was born of fraud. My blood ran cold, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I ripped the loupe from my eye and stared at the signature, the truth of it now screamingly obvious. Asterisk, he drew it. Uncle Robert drew his name. Asterisk, the breath I had been holding escaped me in a ragged, shaky gasp. Had it. The proof was right in front of me. A tiny seismic quake in a line of ink that was about to bring my uncle's world crashing down. A strange, cold calm settled over me. The shock and horror receded, replaced by a crystalline clarity. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. My uncle was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. If I accused him outright, he would deny everything, and the original will, the one with the physical indentation of his forgery, would disappear forever. A photocopy, even a high-resolution one, was not enough. I needed the original document in a room with witnesses. I needed to orchestrate a confrontation he couldn't escape. My mind, so used to piecing together delicate fragments, began to assemble a plan. The key was Mr. Gable. He was the keeper of the original will. I had to get him to produce it without raising his suspicions. I picked up the phone, my hand surprisingly steady. I rehearsed my lines in my head, crafting a persona of the confused, slightly overwhelmed niece. When Mr. Gable's secretary put me through, I filled my voice with gentle uncertainty. "Mr. Gable," I began. "It's Clara Monroe. I'm so sorry to bother you. I was looking at the papers, and there's a small clause about Grandpa's tools. I know it's silly, but I'm just a bit confused about the legal wording. I was hoping I could come by to have you explain it." Mr. Gable was kind, as always. "Of course, my dear. It's no bother at all. When would be a good time for you?" This was the crucial part. "Well," I said, hesitating just enough. "I was thinking, could Mom and Uncle Robert be there too? It's about a family legacy, and I feel like we should all be on the same page. I don't want any misunderstandings." I could hear the faint smile in his voice. He saw it as a gesture of family unity, a young woman trying to do the right thing. "What a thoughtful idea, Clara. Yes, I think that's very wise. I'll arrange it for tomorrow afternoon." The trap was set. The next day, I walked into Mr. Gable's office feeling a strange duality. My insides were a churning sea of anxiety, but on the surface, I projected an aura of quiet resolve. My mother gave me a weak, questioning smile as I sat beside her. Uncle Robert, on the other hand, was radiating impatience. He sat with his legs crossed, tapping an expensive shoe on the Persian rug. "All right, Clara," he said, foregoing any pleasantries. "Let's get this over with. I have a meeting with the auction house at 3. What's this all about?" Mr. Gable settled in behind his large desk. "Clara had some questions regarding the disposition of your father's tools," he explained. "I let them discuss the clause for a few minutes, a meaningless bit of legal text that I pretended to find confusing. Robert was condescending, explaining it to me in slow, simple terms as if I were a child. 'You see, dear, it's quite straightforward. They're yours, to do with as you please.' I let him finish, and then I turned my full attention to the lawyer. "Thank you, Uncle Robert. That's much clearer," I said politely. Then, "Mr. Gable, before we finish, would it be too much trouble to see the original document one last time? There's just something about the paper my grandfather used. I'd like to see it myself." It was a sentimental, slightly eccentric request, perfectly in character for the niece they thought they knew. Robert rolled his eyes, but Mr. Gable obliged. "No trouble at all, Clara." He swiveled in his chair, worked the combination on the large iron safe behind him, and retrieved a heavy vellum envelope. He slid the original will out and placed it on the desk. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, heavy. Robert shifted in his chair, a flicker of something, annoyance, anxiety, crossing his face. I stood up and walked to the desk. I picked up the document, my fingers tracing the edge of the thick, creamy paper. I didn't need my loupe. I didn't need my magnifying lamp. I knew exactly where the lie was hiding. I brought the page close to my face, my glasses nearly brushing the surface. My mother started to make a soft, pitying sound. "Oh, Clara, honey, be careful with that." I held up a single finger, silencing her without looking away from the page. I could feel Robert's stare, hot and intense. I lowered the will and turned to face him, my gaze level and unblinking. My voice, when it came out, was low and steady, completely devoid of the tremor I had seen in his forgery. "Uncle Robert," I said, "when you practiced my grandfather's signature, did you practice it 100 times? 1,000? The color drained from his face. All his practiced smoothness, his confident bluster, vanished in an instant, leaving behind the stark, pale terror of a man exposed. What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice suddenly a full octave higher. "Are you insane?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply pointed a steady finger at the bottom of the page. "I'm talking about this," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Grandpa's tremor, the one he developed in his last few years, it was in his downstrokes, a natural wavering of a tired muscle. But this tremor. I tapped the page right over the tiny, fatal flaw. "This little shake right here, on the top of this isn't the tremor of old age. This is the tremor of hesitation. The tremor of a fraud." I lifted my gaze from my uncle's horrified face and looked directly at Mr. Gable, who was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape. "It's a forgery," I said, the words landing with the weight of absolute certainty. The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. My mother gasped a sharp, choked sound. Robert shot to his feet, his face a mask of purple rage. "This is outrageous. She's delusional. The girl is half blind and she's making up fantasies." But his words were hollow, his panic a stench in the small room. Mr. Gable, his expression now one of dawning horror, slowly reached across his desk and took the will from my hands. He didn't speak. He pulled a heavy, silver-handled magnifying glass from a desk drawer, a tool he likely used for his own failing eyes, and held it over the signature. He leaned in, his face inches from the paper, mimicking the very posture for which my family had always pitied me. He held it there for a long moment, then another. When he finally looked up, first at me and then at Robert, the warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by a glacial fury. The blood had drained from his face. "Oh, Robert," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and disgust. "What have you done?" The carefully constructed world of Robert Monroe shattered in that instant. His denial curdled into panicked blustering. "She's a liar. A blind little fool making up stories because she's jealous," he shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged for the will on the desk, but Mr. Gable was surprisingly fast, snatching it away and holding it to his chest like a sacred text. "Do not touch that," the old lawyer commanded, his voice imbued with a sudden steely authority. "Robert, as your father's executor and an officer of the court, I am now legally and ethically obligated to cease this meeting and contact the district attorney's office. I will be recommending a full forensic analysis of this document." My uncle froze, his hand hovering over the desk. The fight went out of him, replaced by the ashen, slack-jawed look of the truly damned. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a venomous hatred that was almost breathtaking. It was the look of a predator who had been brought down by the one creature it had never even considered a threat. In that moment, all the years of condescension, all the pitying remarks, coalesced into a single satisfying point of impact. I had seen what he had tried to hide. I had seen him. My mother, who had been frozen in her chair, finally moved. She looked from her brother's contorted, guilty face to mine, which was calm and resolute. I could see the shift in her eyes, a lifetime of perception changing in a single heartbeat. The pity that had always been there, the soft, sad sympathy for her disabled daughter, was burned away, replaced by a fierce, brilliant spark of awe. She stood up, walked across the room, and stood beside me, putting a protective arm around my shoulders. She faced her brother, her own voice, so often quiet and fragile, now ringing with a strength I hadn't heard in years. "Robert," she said, the name a condemnation. "How could you? How could you do this to Dad?" To me. The family, already fractured by grief, was now irrevocably broken by truth. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings. A certified forensic document examiner was brought in, a stern woman with her own impressive array of microscopes and imaging software. Her report was definitive. She confirmed everything I had seen with my loupe and more. She pointed out the unnatural pressure variations, the microscopic pen lifts, and most damningly, the hesitation tremor at the apex of the N. It was, in her professional opinion, a clumsy but ambitious forgery. Faced with incontrovertible scientific evidence, Robert's defiance crumbled. Under questioning from the police, he confessed to everything. He admitted to taking advantage of his father's incapacity, to coercing a signature on a blank page under the guise of it being a medical form, and then having the will typed up around it by a shady online service. His greed had made him both audacious and foolish. The authorities launched a search for my grandfather's real will. After a week, it was located exactly where it should have been, in his safe deposit box at the local bank, a box to which Robert, conveniently, did not have access. Mr. Gable read the true will to my mother and me in his office. It was exactly what my grandfather had told me it would be. The estate, the house, and the savings were divided perfectly and equally between his two children. And there was a special codicil. He left the watchmaking business and workshop in a trust, naming me, Clara, as the sole conservator, tasked with preserving his life's work for future generations. It was his final, resounding vote of confidence in me. One afternoon, my mother received a call from the county jail. It was Robert, asking to speak with her. His one last-ditch attempt at manipulation. I watched as she listened, her face impassive. I couldn't hear his words, but I could imagine the desperate pleading, the twisted apologies, the promises. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke. "No, Robert," she said, her voice firm. "There is nothing left to say. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." She hung up the phone and looked at me, a sad but resolute peace on her face. A few days later, I received a call from Mr. Gable. He formally apologized for not spotting the forgery himself. "I'm an old man, Clara," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "My eyes aren't what they used to be. But more than that, I was blind by trust. I never imagined a son could do that to his own father. You saw the truth because you were looking for it. You knew your grandfather's heart. Thank you." His validation was a balm, but I knew deep down that I no longer needed it. I had found my own. 6 months passed. Robert was convicted of forgery and fraud and was sentenced to several years in prison, legally disinherited by the probate court due to his criminal actions. The house was taken off the market. My mother and I together began the slow process of sorting through my grandfather's life, not with the aim of liquidating it, but of honoring it. Our relationship had been reborn. The pity was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. She started asking for my opinion on everything, from financial documents to fabric patterns. "Let me get Clara's eyes on this," became her new refrain, but this time it was said with admiration, not sympathy. The workshop became my world. I spent my days there, surrounded by the scent of oil and old brass, the quiet ticking a comforting chorus. I had thought my job was merely to preserve it, but I soon found that my skills as a book restorer translated remarkably well to the delicate art of horology. The same steady hands, the same patience, the same love for the miniature and mechanical all applied. I began taking in repair jobs, starting with old clocks and pocket watches from the community. One day, an elderly man, a former client of my grandfather's, came in with a vintage Patek Philippe that hadn't run in 30 years. He'd been told it was unsalvageable. I spent a week with it under my loupe, carefully cleaning each gear, replacing a worn pinion, and recalibrating the hairspring. When I was done, I wound it, and it sprang to life with a soft, perfect beat. I handed it back to the old man, and he listened to it, his eyes filling with tears. "Julian would be so proud," he said. I smiled, a genuine, easy smile. I knew he would be. I was no longer just Clara, the woman with the bad eyes. I was Clara Monroe, the watchmaker's granddaughter, a woman who could see what others missed, a woman who could mend what was broken. Looking back now, I see the beautiful, profound irony of it all. The very thing that had been the source of so much shame and frustration for me, the weakness that had defined me in the eyes of my family, was the one thing that armed me to save our legacy. My uncle's crime was arrogance. He believed my vision made me unobservant, that my need to get close to things made me small and powerless. He never imagined that while he was looking at the big picture, the house, the money, the business, I was the only one capable of seeing the tiny damning detail that would unravel his entire scheme. My grandfather was the only one who understood. He knew my focused eyes were a gift. He knew that true sight isn't about how far you can see, but how deeply you can look. He trusted me to be the guardian of his legacy, and in the end, my unique way of seeing the world was exactly what was needed to protect it. My relationship with my mother is stronger and more honest than it has ever been. We are partners now, in business and in life, building on the foundation my grandfather left for us. The workshop is thriving, a testament to the fact that craftsmanship and legacy still matter in a world that moves too fast. Sometimes, the very thing people criticize you for is your greatest superpower. It's the piece of you that is so unique. It allows you to see the world from an angle no one else can. Don't let their limited vision define yours. The world might look blurry from a distance, but up close, where it really matters, you might be the only one who can see the truth. Have you ever been underestimated? Share your story in the comments below, I'd love to read it. And please, don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about turning weaknesses into strengths. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. Remember that family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood, and your own unique perspective is your most valuable asset.